Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. I've got another juicy tidbit in store for you guys. This is one of my favorite analogies for solo queue, something that's personally helped me on my own solo queue journey and helped a lot of people inside the Midlane Academy, and that is that solo queue is like a story. And this is the metaphor that I commonly refer to in my coaching program. Now, before we dive into the metaphor itself, I want to give a bit of context of this example and how this all kind of ties together. So this was a review I did earlier in the week of a Sylas heading into the mid game here. About 17 minutes in, and this is the state of the game. Sylas, 4-2, 1.5 items. For whatever reason, the enemy Illaoi has kind of swapped mid here. This Illaoi is very strong. And for those of you who versed a strong Illaoi like this at 2 items with a Mercs, they would know that Illaoi is a bit of a nuisance, and especially into Jarvan, Aurelia, and Sylas. You know, Illaoi is quite good into these low-range champions that have to run into her, so you can stand her ground, especially in choke points, okay? But the saving grace for this Sylas is that they've got a pretty strong Twitch Yuumi. Now, I believe this Twitch is about to come back by a second item in base, quite strong, and they're going to scale beautifully into the mid to late game. So, from a win condition perspective, this Twitch Yuumi is pretty goddamn important in terms of winning this game. But we also know that this guy, this Illaoi, is absolutely terrifying, okay? So that's kind of to set the scene here and lay the groundwork. So what happens here, the Twitch shoves out the side lane, goes back to base, and comes out of base here. So you'll see in a second, the Twitch, thinking that he's a genius, going to try and make a sneaky pick on maybe onto the Illaoi mid, decides to go through Raptors. But little does he know, the enemy is setting up a bit of a bush camp, and they face check the Raptors, and the Wukong, the Nautilus, are here waiting. He tries to, in desperation, grab the Wukong ult to try and peel, but to no avail. And because he sees the Aurelia and the Jarvan kind of collapsing here, thinks it was a good idea to actually re-engage and turn the fight and try and kill the enemy here. But as you can see, it doesn't really work. They get slapped in the face by those tentacles, and now what would have been a 1-for-0 is now a 3-for-0. Or a 0-for-3, however you want to put it. Not a good scenario, right? Now, this is where the metaphor of League is a story, or solo queue as a story really comes into play. So we're going to go back over here, all right? So, when we read a book, we typically start at page 0 and go all the way to the end. We don't read up until maybe page 10 and then maybe skip another 20 pages and then read the next few pages and skip another 20. No, we do this because context is important. We need to follow the characters, the plot, the narrative. We're going to get confused otherwise, right? In solo queue, tying this back to solo queue, if you were to use a lull state at, say, 10 minutes and get an understanding or take a snapshot of who's strong, who's weak, great. That's going to give us great context of what to do in around this period of time, maybe around the 11-minute mark, maybe even 12-minute mark. But as we know in solo queue, shit can change pretty goddamn quickly. Someone can get a few bounties, someone can start dying a few times, things can go wrong or things can go well. Conversely, someone who was strong can now be weak, someone who's weak can now be strong. So if we only use this lull state at 10 minutes and we hadn't used another lull state until 17 minutes, our understanding or context of the game is going to be very off. We're going to have an inaccurate assessment of who's strong, who's weak, and our ability to appropriately react to situations around us is going to be very off. Our feel for the situation is going to be very off. So, a lot of people struggle to review these, chaotic skirmishes like this. They don't really know what to take away. Now, there's two potential problems here. The client either has perfect context, they've used their lull states, they understand everyone, who's strong, who's weak, so on and so forth, in which case they willingly re-engage here, thinking that they could actively turn it. And that's a completely reasonable assumption to come to. If you felt as though, you could turn it, so be it, right? In which case the learning here would be, Illaoi is quite strong in these situations, and given how weak Sylas and Jarvan and Aurelia were relative to that Illaoi, it probably wasn't the right play in hindsight. Nonetheless, great learning, right? We learned a little bit about how our champs interact into Wukong Illaoi. We learned that we probably need to be more conservative around these champions, especially when the Illaoi is quite fed. Maybe we don't want to fight in these choke points, so on and so forth. So we're learning a lot about maybe the execution aspect, as well as maybe threat assessment, and how our champions fundamentally interact. And this is going to allow us to develop a much more sophisticated understanding of the game moving forward in these sorts of situations. But Tying back to the other type of problem. If you had not used, your lol states, and let's say you lacked context, that means that you can't really jump to the conclusion and really take it at face value and look at it at a micro perspective. You need to rewind to be like, okay, well, if I was lacking context and I had no idea who was strong and who was weak, then that is a lol state problem. That is a lack of context problem. That is a gathering information problem. These are two very, very, very different problems. Okay, this ties into a broader discussion in terms of, lol states, which we'll get to in a second, but tying back to the metaphor that League is a story, essentially, if let's say the Silas hadn't used this lol state, hadn't calibrated who was strong and weak, the equivalent of what he's done is maybe read up to page 10, skip forward to page 17 and be like, yeah, I don't really know what's going on. Right? But someone who's actively processed that information throughout the game, calibrated throughout those lol states, updated their hypothesis, updated their I guess understanding of the map state and who's strong, who's weak, is going to have a much better chance or a much higher likelihood of adapting appropriately to these situations. So guys, when you're reviewing these situations, you're trying to get max value from the review and you're trying to really, maximize the amount of learning here. Be honest with yourself. Did you have clarity over the context of this scenario? Were you aware of where everyone is and heading into it in the lol state and how strong everyone was relative to each other and kind of what the win condition was? Or were you essentially going in blind? And a lot of the time, we don't really want to know that answer. It's going to hurt our ego, but that's the reality. So the last thing I want to say, just quickly touching on lol states, is that when it comes to lol states and all this stuff here, there's kind of three phases. There is the gathering of information in the lol states. There is the processing of information. And then there's the execution. Where are you breaking down? That's a very important question to ask yourself. Okay? So if you're ever confused about what's going on, bring it back to the story. Were you following the story of this solo queue game? And every solo queue game is a story, as a new story. That's why when we queue up, we've got to get ready to close the last book, leave that one on the shelf. We're opening a new book. We're in a new story here. Get ready to embrace the new journey. So hopefully this helps you on your solo queue journey, especially with your reviews. If you have any questions about this metaphor, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to reply. Cheers, guys.